Have you ever noticed how the people who reflect the most on life, who ask the deepest questions and can see beyond everyday illusions, often find themselves isolated? How those who develop a sharper awareness of the nature of human existence seem destined to walk alone through territories most people prefer to avoid? Perhaps you've experienced this peculiar form of loneliness yourself, the kind that doesn't come from a lack of people around, but from the absence of minds that share the same thirst for deep understanding. This is not a cruel coincidence of fate, nor a punishment for overthinking. It is, in fact, a natural and inevitable consequence of how our species has evolved to process reality and construct collective meaning. The loneliness of heightened consciousness is a phenomenon that spans cultures and eras, and understanding it can teach us not only about the nature of human knowledge, but also about the hidden costs of wisdom. To understand why more developed consciousness leads to isolation, we must first recognize that most of human life is built upon collective fictions that allow us to function as a society. Since the earliest human gatherings tens of thousands of years ago, our species has developed the extraordinary ability to create and share imaginary narratives that give meaning to the world and coordinate the behavior of millions of individuals. These narratives include concepts such as money, nations, religions, justice systems, and social hierarchies. None of these elements have objective existence in nature, but all are as real in their consequences as any physical force. A colored piece of paper only becomes money because we all agree it represents value. A national border exists only because millions of people believe in its legitimacy. A caste system only works because an entire society accepts its premises about human worth. The genius of these fictions lies not in their truth, but in their utility for organizing large-scale, complex behavior. The problem arises when certain individuals begin to see through these constructs. When the mind develops the capacity to question the fundamental foundations of social reality, it inevitably discovers that much of what we consider solid and permanent is in fact arbitrary and contingent. This awakening of critical consciousness can be intellectually liberating, but is profoundly alienating socially. Imagine trying to explain to someone who is completely immersed in a reality that this reality is, to a great extent, a collective construction. It's like trying to convince a fish that water exists. For those who have never questioned the basic premises of social existence, the very idea that such premises can be questioned sounds like madness or intellectual arrogance. Heightened consciousness also brings with it a sharper perception of the contradictions inherent in the human condition. While most people can live comfortably with logical inconsistencies and moral paradoxes, those with greater reflective capacity often become hypersensitive to these contradictions. They notice how we celebrate values that we systematically violate, how we build identities based on artificial oppositions, how we seek meaning in activities they recognize as fundamentally hollow. This acute awareness of human contradictions creates a particular kind of suffering because it makes it impossible to uncritically adhere to the comforting narratives that sustain most people. When you clearly see how people deceive themselves about their motivations, how they construct elaborate rationalizations for selfish behavior, how they confuse personal preferences with universal truths, it becomes increasingly difficult to find genuine intellectual companionship. Contemporary technology has dramatically intensified this phenomenon. We live in an era of unprecedented informational abundance, where anyone with internet access can explore ideas that were once restricted to small circles of scholars and philosophers. This democratization of knowledge has created a new category of individuals, those with high critical consciousness who do not belong to the traditional institutional structures that historically housed thinkers. They exist scattered throughout the general population, like islands of reflection in an ocean of algorithmic distraction. Paradoxically, although we are more technologically connected than ever before, these individuals often feel more isolated than thinkers of previous generations, who at least could find intellectual community in universities, literary salons, or philosophical circles. The loneliness of heightened consciousness also has deep evolutionary roots. For most of human history, excessively questioning established social norms was a risky survival strategy. Tribal communities depended on cohesion and conformity to face external threats and coordinate subsistence activities. Individuals who constantly questioned traditions and hierarchies could be seen as threats to social stability and consequently be ostracized or eliminated. Although we now live in much more complex societies that are more tolerant of diverse thought, we still carry these ancestral predispositions in our psychology. There is a fundamental tension between the human need for social belonging and the drive for deep understanding of reality. Most people resolve this tension by choosing belonging, accepting the cognitive limitations that come with it. Those who prioritize understanding often pay the price in terms of social connection. Another crucial aspect of this dynamic is that heightened consciousness often reveals the futility of many of the activities that consume most human time and energy. When you deeply understand the arbitrariness of social hierarchies, the transience of cultural trends, the manipulation behind media narratives, and the emptiness of many of the goals our society presents as valuable, it becomes hard to participate in these games with the same enthusiasm as others. This perception can lead to a form of existential paralysis, where a person feels unable to fully engage with activities they recognize as essentially trivial, but also finds themselves isolated from those who still find meaning in them. It's like being trapped between two worlds: the world of shared illusions, where one can have company, but not authenticity, and the world of solitary clarity, where one can have authenticity, but not company. Language itself becomes a barrier for those with more developed consciousness. The words we use to describe complex inner experiences were shaped by and for communication within conventional conceptual structures. When someone develops perceptions that transcend those structures, they often find they lack adequate vocabulary to share their insights with others. It's like trying to describe colors to someone who only sees in black and white, or explain music to someone born deaf. Communication becomes frustrating and often misunderstood, leading the conscious person to withdraw more and more from social dialogue and seek refuge in silence or solitary expression through writing, art, or contemplation. There is also a moral responsibility that comes with heightened consciousness, which can intensify loneliness. When you clearly see the patterns of unnecessary suffering that permeate human society, when you understand how many problems could be solved if people simply changed certain beliefs or behaviors, you may feel an obligation to try to awaken others to these insights. However, discovering that most people actively resist insights that could improve their lives is deeply discouraging. This resistance is not malice or stupidity, but a natural consequence of how the human mind protects its existing structures of meaning. Still, for the one who sees clearly, it can feel like watching people deliberately choose to remain in a prison whose doors are not locked. The frustration and sadness resulting from this perception can lead to social withdrawal as a mechanism of emotional protection. The digital age brought promises that it would be easier to find communities of people with similar interests and perspectives. But in practice, it has also created new forms of isolation. The algorithms that govern social platforms tend to create superficial echo chambers based on political preferences or cultural tastes, not depth of thought or reflective capacity. Someone might find thousands of people who agree with their opinions on a given topic and still feel completely alone if those people do not share their level of fundamental questioning about the nature of reality. Furthermore, the speed and superficiality of digital communication often prevent the kind of slow, contemplative, and nuanced dialogue that people with heightened consciousness value. In an environment where complexity is reduced to memes and deep reflections are condensed into tweets, those who need more space and time to explore ideas may feel like foreigners in a strange land. The loneliness of heightened consciousness is also amplified by the increasing specialization of knowledge in our society. While in the past, an educated person could reasonably expect to have meaningful conversations on a wide range of topics with other educated members of their community, today, knowledge is so fragmented that even experts in related fields often cannot communicate effectively with each other. For someone with broad intellectual interests and the ability to make connections across different domains of knowledge, it can be nearly impossible to find others who can keep up with conversations that freely move between science, philosophy, art, history, and psychology. The very structure of modern education and professions encourages deep specialization at the expense of breadth, creating a world of specialists who know a lot about little and little about a lot. Paradoxically, heightened consciousness often brings with it a greater capacity for empathy and understanding of human motivations, but this same understanding can make relationships more difficult, not easier. When you can see through the masks people wear, when you understand the insecurities and fears that drive seemingly confident behavior, when you recognize the unconscious patterns that govern most social interactions, it becomes difficult to participate in those interactions with the spontaneity they require. It's like trying to enjoy a magic trick after learning how it works. Knowledge of the underlying mechanisms destroys the illusion necessary for enjoyment. Similarly, Knowing too much about how social dynamics operate can make participating in those dynamics feel forced and artificial. The temporal dimension also plays an important role in the loneliness of heightened consciousness. People with greater reflective capacity often operate on different timescales than the general population. They tend to think in terms of decades or centuries, not just years, and worry about long-term consequences that seem abstract to others. This expanded temporal perspective can make conversations about trivial everyday concerns feel frustrating, while their own concerns about long-term civilizational trends may seem overly abstract or pessimistic to others. It's hard to find companionship when you are constantly aware of the brevity of individual life, in contrast to the vastness of cosmic time, or when you see historical patterns repeating, while others believe each era is fundamentally unique. There is also a spiritual or transcendental dimension to the solitude of heightened consciousness that goes beyond intellectual considerations. Many contemplative traditions recognize that greater awareness inevitably leads to experiences of unity or interconnectedness that are difficult to communicate and may leave one feeling even more isolated in their understanding. When you directly experience the illusory nature of the separate self, or have insights into the fundamental nature of reality that transcend conceptual descriptions, you may find yourself in an experiential territory that very few others inhabit. This is not necessarily a negative experience in itself, but it can intensify the feeling of living in a world different from the rest of humanity. I need to pause for a moment to ask you directly, have you ever felt this specific kind of loneliness? That feeling of being surrounded by people, yet still fundamentally alone because no one around you seems to question the things you can't stop questioning? I know that we often keep these feelings to ourselves, perhaps out of fear of seeming arrogant or confirming that we really are different in some way we can't change. But your experience is valid and shared by more people than you think. If this feeling resonates with you, share in the comments, I feel most alone when I realize that. Your honesty might be exactly what someone else needs to read today to understand they're not alone on this particular journey of awareness. Technology promised to connect us, but it has created new forms of isolation that are particularly acute for those with heightened consciousness. Social networks, for example, often reward superficial thinking, quick emotional reactions, and conformity to ideological tribes, not deep contemplation or fundamental questioning. Someone who takes time to consider multiple perspectives before forming an opinion, who sees nuance where others see certainty, who questions basic premises that others take for granted, often feels out of place in these environments. Digital culture rewards speed over depth, conviction over intellectual humility, simplicity over complexity. For minds that naturally operate more slowly and contemplatively, that value conceptual precision over rhetorical impact, this environment can be not only frustrating, but genuinely alienating. Modern education also inadvertently contributes to this phenomenon. Although we have educational systems that theoretically promote critical thinking, in practice, they often encourage intellectual conformity and deference to authority. Students learn to give the expected answers, not necessarily to ask deeper questions. Those who naturally question fundamental premises or who see connections that transcend disciplinary boundaries often feel out of place in formal education. They may be labeled as problematic, distracted, or overly complicated. This early experience of not fitting in can establish a pattern of intellectual isolation that persists into adulthood. The world of work presents similar challenges. Most professions require some degree of acceptance of organizational premises that may seem arbitrary or counterproductive to someone with sharp critical insight. Attending meetings where important decisions are made based on flawed logic, witnessing how political considerations often outweigh objective evidence, observing how egos and power dynamics shape outcomes supposedly based on merit can be deeply discouraging. The conscious person faces a difficult choice: adapt to the system and compromise their intellectual integrity, or maintain authenticity and accept limitations in professional advancement and social integration. The pressure to conform socially is particularly intense because our culture often confuses deep questioning with negativity or pessimism. Someone who points out logical inconsistencies may be labeled as overly critical. One who questions dominant narratives may be seen as conspiratorial or paranoid. One who expresses awareness of the arbitrariness of many social conventions may be considered cynical or destructive. This confusion between critical analysis and negative attitude makes it even harder for conscious individuals to find social acceptance without sacrificing their intellectual authenticity. The irony is that those with heightened awareness often have a greater capacity to contribute positively to society precisely because they can see problems and solutions that others do not. Their broader perspective and deeper questioning can lead to valuable insights on how to improve social systems, resolve complex conflicts, or navigate collective challenges. However, these same qualities that make them potentially valuable also make them socially isolated, creating a situation in which those who could help most often have the least direct social influence. There is a particular generational dimension to this phenomenon that deserves consideration. Each generation develops its own version of collective fictions adapted to its time, and those who question these fictions may find themselves alienated not only from their peers, but also from older and younger generations. A young person who questions narratives about career and success that motivate their generation may feel disconnected from friends who enthusiastically embrace those narratives. At the same time, their perspectives may seem naive or idealistic to older generations who have already gone through their own cycles of questioning and acceptance. This intergenerational alienation can intensify the feeling of being out of time, not fully belonging to any era or group. Heightened consciousness also brings a sharper awareness of mortality and finitude that can be socially isolating. When you are constantly aware of the brevity of life, the inevitability of death, the impermanence of all human constructs, it can be difficult to get excited about concerns that others see as vitally important. Conversations about material acquisitions, professional status, social gossip, or trivial entertainment can seem not only irrelevant, but almost surreal in their disconnection from the fundamental realities of existence. This perspective can be philosophically liberating, but socially alienating, when most social interactions revolve around topics you consider fundamentally unimportant. The issue of language becomes even more complex when we consider that people with heightened awareness often develop more precise and nuanced ways of thinking about complex concepts. They may make conceptual distinctions that others do not, use terms with meanings more specific than common usage, or operate with definitions of important words like freedom, justice, love, or success that differ significantly from conventional definitions. This conceptual precision, while valuable for clarity of thought, can make communication with others more difficult and can make one seem pedantic or overly complicated. The phenomenon also has deep psychological aspects related to identity formation. Our identity is largely constructed through our social relationships and group affiliations, but when someone fundamentally questions the categories and structures through which society organizes identities, they may be left without clear reference points for self-understanding. If you don't identify with conventional political categories because you see their limitations, if you don't define yourself through religious affiliations because you've questioned their premises, if you don't base your identity on professional achievements because you understand their arbitrariness, then on what basis do you build a coherent sense of who you are? This identity crisis can contribute to isolation because it makes it difficult to find social tribes with which to genuinely identify. The emotional dimension of heightened consciousness also deserves attention. Greater awareness often comes with greater emotional sensitivity, not only to your own internal experiences, but to the suffering and contradictions you see around you. This hypersensitivity can make the social world an emotionally exhausting place. Witnessing people hurting themselves unnecessarily, observing destructive patterns, seeing human potential wasted due to limiting beliefs can be deeply painful for someone who cannot simply shut off their awareness. Isolation can be a strategy for emotional as well as intellectual protection. Paradoxically, although people with heightened awareness often feel lonely, they can also develop a greater capacity to find meaning and fulfillment in solitude. When you deeply understand the nature of human existence, when you've developed a rich relationship with your own inner experiences, when you can find endless fascination in observing and contemplating the patterns of reality, the need for external social validation may diminish. This is not necessarily compensation for a lack of social connection, but a genuine recognition that some of life's deepest and most meaningful experiences are inherently solitary. History is full of examples of individuals who faced this kind of isolation. Philosophers, artists, scientists, and spiritual visionaries often reported profound loneliness resulting from their insights. Socrates was considered a disturber of social order for asking questions others preferred not to consider. Galileo was persecuted for observations that contradicted established beliefs. Van Gogh lived in artistic isolation that was only recognized after his death. Buddha left his palace and family to seek understanding that no one around him could share. These examples are not just historical curiosities, but illustrations of a fundamental pattern. Consciousness that transcends social norms often demands the sacrifice of conventional social belonging. Yet it is important to recognize that this loneliness is not necessarily permanent or absolute. Although people with heightened consciousness may struggle to find community in the size and frequency that others do, they often form deeper and more meaningful connections when they meet others who share their perspective. A single conversation with someone who truly understands can be worth more than hundreds of superficial social interactions. Quality can compensate for quantity when it comes to authentic human connection. The digital age, despite its limitations, has also offered new possibilities for these rare connections. Through online platforms, people with similar perspectives can connect across geographical distances that would have made such encounters impossible in previous generations. While digital communication may not fully replace physical presence, it can provide a sense of intellectual community that partially alleviates isolation. Books, podcasts, videos, and other forms of media can also provide a form of intellectual companionship, even if unidirectional. It is crucial to understand that elevated consciousness is not morally or intellectually superior to conventional consciousness, just different in its priorities and perceptions. People who operate within conventional conceptual frameworks are not less intelligent or valuable. They have simply chosen, consciously or unconsciously, to prioritize different aspects of the human experience. Social belonging, emotional stability, cultural participation, and shared purpose gained through the acceptance of conventional narratives are legitimate and important values. The choice between greater individual awareness and greater social integration is a matter of temperament and personal values, not of objective superiority. Recognizing this can help reduce some of the more painful aspects of the loneliness of elevated consciousness. When you understand that your perspective is simply one among many valid ways of navigating human existence, when you stop judging others for their different choices and stop judging yourself for your own difference, isolation can transform from a form of suffering into a particular form of authenticity. Loneliness can cease to be a punishment for thinking too much and become simply the natural price of a particular life choice. Furthermore, it is important to remember that elevated consciousness, although it can lead to social isolation, can also provide unique forms of satisfaction and meaning. The ability to see patterns others do not see, to make connections that transcend conventional conceptual boundaries, to question fundamental premises of existence, can be a source of deep fascination and wonder. When you are able to see through the illusions that governed human life, you can also access perspectives on beauty, truth, and meaning that are less accessible to those who operate entirely within those illusions. The loneliness of elevated consciousness can also be a catalyst for unique creativity and contribution. When you cannot find existing ideas or perspectives that satisfy your understanding, you may be driven to create new forms of expression, new ways of thinking, new kinds of art or philosophy. Many of the deepest and most enduring works of human culture have emerged from this tension between individual vision and social isolation. The need to express perspectives that find no echo in mainstream culture can result in contributions that eventually expand the possibilities of the entire culture. There is also a dimension of potential service in the experience of elevated consciousness. Those who can see beyond conventional illusions can serve as bridges for others who are beginning to question their own premises. They can offer conceptual maps for territories that others are starting to explore. While they may feel alone in their journey, their presence and expression can provide vital beacons for others following similar paths. Loneliness can be transformed into a form of service when the conscious individual chooses to share their insights in ways that may benefit others. Understanding this dynamic can also help those who love people with elevated consciousness better understand their experiences. If you have a friend, partner, or family member who constantly questions things you take for granted, who often feels isolated despite having people around them, who struggles to engage in conventional social activities, recognizing that this may result from a different cognitive structure, not from negativity or arrogance, can open up possibilities for deeper forms of understanding and connection. You may not share their perspective, but you can value their authenticity and offer forms of support that recognize their particular needs. The issue of elevated consciousness and loneliness also invites us to reflect on what kinds of society we want to create. A culture that values only conformity and offers no space for deep questioning is a culture that wastes some of its most valuable human resources. Creating physical and virtual spaces where deep thinking is valued, where fundamental questions can be explored without judgment, where connections based on intellectual authenticity can flourish, would benefit not only those with elevated consciousness, but all of society by allowing for the kinds of insights and solutions that emerge only when conventional perspectives are questioned. Looking to the future, it is likely that the number of people experiencing this type of consciousness will continue to grow. Expanded access to information, the collapse of some traditional narratives of meaning, and the acceleration of social and technological change all contribute to environments where more people are driven to question fundamental premises about reality and meaning. This may result in more people experiencing the loneliness of elevated consciousness, as well as more opportunities for these people to find each other and create new forms of community based on shared authenticity and questioning. If these reflections have touched on something you've been feeling, but perhaps haven't found words to express, know that you are not alone, even when you feel completely isolated in your perspective. By joining our community, you will connect with others who share this particular journey of questioning and discovery. Each week, we explore together the great questions that define our era, not to find simple answers, but to deepen our understanding of the complexities and beauties of human existence. This is a space where your intellectual authenticity is valued, where your deep questions are welcome, where questioning is seen as an act of courage, not of negativity? Subscribe so we can continue this essential conversation about what it means to navigate life with elevated consciousness in a world that often values surface over depth. The loneliness of elevated consciousness is not a flaw or punishment, but a natural consequence of choosing authenticity over superficial belonging, deep understanding over easy comfort, hard questions over simple answers. It is the price some pay for a particular form of intellectual integrity. And while that price may be high in terms of conventional social connection, it also opens the door to experiences of meaning, beauty, and understanding that are less accessible to those who have never left familiar conceptual territories. The question is not how to avoid this loneliness, but how to transform it from a source of suffering into a source of authenticity and perhaps a